Today's subject is self-reliance versus self-reliance. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. Last week, we considered the need for attunement with God, with the gurus, and with the wisdom of others, until we make that wisdom our own. There's a strong and in fact valid belief nowadays in the need for standing on one's own feet, rather than depending weakly on others to carry us by their strength. Swami Kriyananda was once asked, "What is the best yoga posture?" "That one," he replied, "which sets you squarely on your own 2 feet." Our strength must come from within. If that strength comes from the ego, however, instead of from soul consciousness, it is like a guitar string without its sounding board. The notes it emits will be thin and feeble. Our strength must come from within, but must be coupled with recognition of our inner link with broader and higher realities. The Bhagavad Gita says in the 10th chapter, "Everyone in this world whose life is glorious or prosperous or powerful know that his achievement is but a little spark from the great sun of my effulgence." Jesus, in talking to his disciples, emphasized also the power of attunement with his own consciousness as a ray of the divine. For this ray had descended already through him in response to their devotion. It was a sign that God was already listening to them with receptive attention and did not require to be wooed in that way any longer. In the passage preceding the one that we read last week, Jesus said, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away, and every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeth it, that it may bring forth more fruit. Now ye are clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine, no more can ye, except ye abide in me." This was the meaning of Paramhansa Yogananda's counsel also, when speaking more intimately to the disciples of the need for attunement with him. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om. Thank you. In my new book, Hope for a Better World, there's an interesting passage. Part of what might be called tongue-in-cheek the American mystique is the lone cowboy. Movies with Gary Cooper spring to mind, riding into town with easy nonchalance, indifferent to the hostility and fear all around him. I saw an interesting example of this attitude during a television interview many years ago. The guest was one of those laconic, do-your-own-thing people. He was, however, a guest and had accepted the invitation of a guest of his own free will. He had, therefore, at least some of a guest's obligations. The host, intrigued by the man's aloofness, managed nevertheless to treat him with courtesy. Halfway through the interview, the visitor rose up from his seat, draped his jacket casually over one shoulder, and left the room without a backward glance. The camera followed him all the way to the door. This indifference to the opinions of others has lingered in my mind of a statement of individuality that seemed very American, impressive in its own way, but also insulting and insensitive. Was this behavior an example of Emersonian self-reliance? Was it a demonstration of personal integrity? It struck me rather as the deliberate pose behind which pride hid its sneering face. There's so many poses that people assume in life, trying to figure out who they really are. So many different personalities. I recently watched the movie, which I imagine many or most of you have seen, with Danny Kaye, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. It's really a very good movie, but it's also very true to life in a sense, exaggerated in order to make a point. Danny Kaye is this sort of little wimp. It's based on a story of James Thurber, and this wimp dreams of himself in these heroic roles as a great air ace in the war, as a great surgeon, as a great cowboy, as a great this and a great that. And of course, the intriguing thing in the movie itself is that Danny Kaye suddenly finds himself enmeshed in a real drama and has to come out the actual hero in this drama. But we, all of us, live in an attempt to sort of adopt ourselves to one role or another. There was a friend of mine who had a little baby whom she wanted to get potty trained, and he just didn't want to. And she said to him one time, "Come on, you're not a baby any longer." And he said, "But I like being a baby." And you know, it's actually people play their roles, whatever they may be. It's curious how suddenly a little boy, let's say is the oldest of the several siblings, if their parents die in a car accident or some tragic way, how very quickly this older child suddenly assumes the role of an adult. How we act the part of children, we act the part of adults, we act the part of women, we act the part of men, we act our roles, and we assume them to the point where we think that is who I am. But so much of our problems are trying to figure out who we are, and finally we do figure it out, and in the end, how boring it becomes. We would like to be a lot more. We would like to be sort of like Walter Mitty, who can do all these different things and do them well. And probably over many incarnations, we get a chance. Everybody gets a chance to be all those things. And sometimes, because any line of action that you set in motion, you've got to become good at before you can move on to another, not because there's somebody up there ordering you to be good, but because there's something in you that, having started that desire, wants to fulfill it. And so when you find somebody astoundingly capable, like Mozart at the age of 5, writing a symphony, when he was in his 30s, he died in his 30s actually, some younger composer asked him how to write a symphony. And Mozart said, well, if you want to write a symphony, you've got to start easily with easier things. You've got to start as with string quartets, with maybe a piano and voice, little pieces, gradually learn the parts of a symphony and build up to the point where you can write a whole symphony. And the composer, the young composer, said to him, but you didn't do that. Mozart said, yes, but I didn't have to ask. He knew. When you don't know, you've got to do these things. But how do you know? How can a person know? There's some things you just know instinctively. It's because you've done it before. I remember I said to Yogananda one time, I was out of the desert, and I said to him, I've always wanted to live alone like this in the desert or in the mountains, just alone. He said, that's because you've done it before. He said, most of those who are with me have done it many times in the past. Well, any instinctive, deep recognition that you feel for one way of life or another, one particular talent or another. It's certainly something in your subconscious that you've brought with you from the past. And every one that you develop, you've got to go through all these things. Not because, again, there's somebody up there telling you you've got to, but because there's something in our nature that is always looking across the fence and seeing that the grass looks greener over there. So you think, well, okay, I tried being a airplane pilot this time. Maybe I'd like to be a gardener next time, or maybe I'd like to be I think that Mozart would not probably come back writing music after a certain period. Maybe in his next life he did, but surely the time would come when he would say, well, I've had it with that. Let me try to be an engineer, architect, who knows? There's so many different things we can do. Every one of us has done a lot of things in the past, and all of us have a certain amount of memory, and we feel a certain gift at certain ways of expressing ourselves. We don't know why we have that gift, we just know. How do we know? Because we've done it before. It's a memory. And yet each one, and this is a fascinating thing, every single role that you have played, no one else has ever played exactly the same way you did. Because there's something in you that never changes. That I, that essential ego, is yours forever. You're stuck with it, kid. Can't help it. You might as well enjoy it. But the trouble is, the only way to enjoy it is to enjoy it in the right way. You see, when you start thinking that I think this is my self-definition, you limit yourself. And in limiting yourself, you begin to feel constricted. You begin to feel, well, yeah, but I don't want to be only this. So like Walter Mitty, you burst out and become a surgeon and this thing and that thing, or over many lifetimes you become these various roles. But there's something in you that feels so small in this little body with this little ego consciousness. We want more. Now, there's an illustration that I used in my talk yesterday for those of you who got to come. And it's a very important one. Yogananda described the difference between people as essentially one thing only. He used the illustration of a gas stove, that the same gas is producing all the jets on that little stove. Each jet seems separate from every other, and yet it's all being produced by the same flow of gas. Now, you could change the appearance of those jets in a stove. They're all the same. But supposing you made one jet big, another one small, you'd have a big flame, a small flame. Supposing you introduced little chemical powders, one flame would look orange, another green, another blue. Supposing you got away from gas jets and took people, and took not only colors, and not only size, but all the variants of personality, you begin to think you're looking at something individual. But it's not really individual. It's the same consciousness that is animating every brain, animating every personality, animating every like and dislike. And whereas you seem, and it's just amazing when you look at any crowd of people. I'm looking at a small crowd of people right here. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. You wouldn't think that God could produce this much variety. Every one of you is different. How does he do it? Because the consciousness behind each one seems different. The underlying consciousness is the same, but as it manifests itself through each individual, it comes in through those little holes, you might say, of the personality, and each one burns a different color, a different quality, a different likes and dislikes, and so each one is very different. An amazing thing about Yogananda was that I never could remember what he looked like. I lived with him. I saw him day after day. I could never remember what he looked like. I can't say that for anybody else that I know. As soon as I think of them, I think of their face. It comes clearly to mind. And I say, oh yeah, there's he and she and this one and that one. With Yogananda, it just didn't dawn on me. I had to look at a photograph. You'd think, well, that doesn't make sense. But you know why? because he really wasn't anything specific. He didn't have a personality in the sense of likes and dislikes, tendencies, none of that. He was a clean slate. Two amazing photographs that I've always remembered were one where he was standing with Portes Gil, who was the president of Mexico at that time. Portes Gil, sounds like the name, he was portly. And he was sort of strong like this. Yogananda standing next to him, darned if he didn't look like Portes Gil. He was portly and strong, and he didn't assume it. He just looked like that. Well, okay, you could say, all right, maybe he was portly, maybe he did look like Portes Gil. But the thing that astounded me was there's another photograph of him with Amelita Galli-Curci, who was an Italian famous soprano like Caruso, but a great singer, and very thin, small, frail, elderly at the time. And Yogananda, this seemingly portly person, I mean, he was with Portes Gil, wasn't he? Looking small, frail, just incredible. And his body structure hadn't changed. It wasn't that he got more muscles or less muscles. It wasn't as if there was some pneumatic pump inside that and made him larger or small. It was his consciousness that was different. And if you look at people, yes, the features are different, but I had an interesting experience. There was somebody I knew very well who was going through a hard time when I wasn't with her. And I had to meet her in Foligno, a little town station in Assisi. And I went there, I went to the train, everybody got off, I didn't see her. I thought, well, surely she made the train. I walked into the main terminal, went to the waiting room. There was one woman standing there, and I thought, well, that can't be she. And I thought, well, there's nobody else. And I looked again. It was she. The same person, a person I knew well, but because she was going through a time of testing and difficulty, she looked completely different. People, even in their own bodies, can change enormously. But the truth is, you look at, let's say, a beautiful young girl, rosy cheeks, radiant smile. I remember a couple of 17-year-old girls who got on a bus in San Francisco, and they were so lovely and smiling and joyful, and I could see that everybody on the bus was envying them. And I thought, well, I'd like to see them in 10 years. Because, that same girl at 50 could be hard, bitter, disillusioned with life. Not at all the way she was when she was 17 and looking forward to all. The world was her oyster, you might say, as Emerson did say. And which one is the real woman? The answer is neither. You're not your personality. This is a filter you've assumed. You've taken on certain things. Karma gave you a beautiful face or a beautiful body, and you act it for a while, then you get polio and you no longer can move in the same way. Are you a different person? No. And when you talk to a cripple, you don't talk to a damaged machine. You're talking to a human being. You are much more than this body. You're much more than this appearance. You're something inside. Now, this inside person is something that doesn't change. But here's the illustration that I want you to keep in mind, that the gas, when it's going out toward the jet, is like that divine consciousness coming up through the ego and manifesting itself in all this variety. But that same jet, if it were conscious, looking backward at its source, would see that it was one with the same gas that produced all these things. Now, the self that produces you as a personality is the same self that produces all personalities. This is what was beautiful about Yogananda, that he didn't have an ego of his own. He said, I killed Yogananda long ago. No one dwells in this temple now but God. And I must say, living with him, I was always inwardly, I just felt I was in the presence of God. I could not shake that feeling. It's not that I tried to, but it was just something so real. And I remember being with him and seeing that this is somebody who knows every thought. In fact, you might be scared to live with somebody who knew every thought you think, but that's how he was. That's why not everybody gets to have a guru. They've got to be ready to be exposed. I know there was one time this two brother disciples of mine, they were going down to Encinitas to see Yogananda, and as young men will, they were talking about things they shouldn't. Yogananda met them at the gate, and he said, "You're on the path now, you're monks, you should not talk about these things." And he quoted to them exactly what they'd been saying to each other. Well, what could they do? I remember one time I was at a place where there were a lot of atheistic people, and one of them was challenging me about my yoga beliefs and so on, and I was trying to convert him, trying to interest him. I think, well, I didn't realize that you can't talk about these things to everybody, and I was talking to this man about certain miracles I had seen. Well, this man was a psychiatrist, and I'm sure that in his mind he was thinking, now maybe I can make it a point for appointment with him for Monday. He was obviously not taking in anything that I was saying, just thinking I was a potential patient. Well, when I saw Yogananda a few days later, we were sitting at the table alone for a minute, and he said, "By the way, when you're with people who are skeptics, don't talk about miracles." And I said, "You know?" I was so surprised that he would even know a little thing like this. But what amazed me was his answer. He said, "I know every thought you think." Well, that's an amazing statement. Amazing statement to make, more amazing still to prove it. And he proved it again and again. One time he gave some disciple a instruction to do something, and she didn't want to do it. So when he left the room, she started praying to Babaji. And he came, opened the door again, and said, "No fair praying over my head." You see, he's in touch with you because you're in touch with everything. You're not separate. Those little jets of flame look as if they were separate, but if the gas were turned off, they'd cease to exist. And the same gas that animates all those jets animates your jet. The same gas that animates your jet animates all jets. The same God that is in you is in everybody. Somebody was worrying one time, talking to an Indian saint, and worrying about the future of the world. It looks like it's such a mess. And her answer was beautiful. She said, "He who made this world, don't you think he knows how to take care of it?" Sometimes you'd like him to act a little more quickly, but he knows what he's doing. He knows that people have their lessons to learn. He knows they've got to go through their own problems in order to grow. And if he came in with miracles and saved the day like the U.S. cavalry, maybe he would prevent you from learning things that you need. And so it is that God's ways and God's timing is not always our timing, but it's infallible, it's impeccable. Always you learn what you need to do or are given the opportunity to learn, because I have to say that man's talent for self-deception, man's gift at stubbornness, man's sheer stupidity is incredible. But bit by bit, if he doesn't succeed once, he'll try again, and over a few, maybe billion of years, you'll come out on top in the end. You've got to. There's no chance. The one thing you can't get away from, you can't get away from yourself. And for a while, this self thinks that it's a pirate, a business tycoon, a housewife, a merchant, a butcher, a baker, and all these things, each time thinking that's you, each time doing it in your own way, however, but bit by bit, as Yogananda put it in Autobiography of a Yogi, it assumes a sort of anguishing monotony. You begin to think, how long do I have to keep on dealing with this body, dealing with these ups and downs, thinking I've got it together finally, only to discover that one more time it blew it again. And do you realize that you could never do anything but blow it? You know why I'm saying that? Because this whole world is based on duality. It's like a pendulum. The pendulum swings this way. It has to swing the opposite direction, the same distance. Because all duality is balanced. Every light is balanced by a darkness. Every success has to be balanced by a failure. Every pleasure has to be balanced by a pain. Without this balancing duality, the universe would dissolve and become one again, one with spirit. The way God was able to create the universe was by creating these waves of vibration that make for all that we see around us. This whole world, science tells us this whole world is composed of vibration. Now, with that fact, you have to realize that the more you push that pendulum this way and to put flesh and bones on it, I'm going to make that million, I'm going to make that million, I'm going to make that million, and finally you make that million. No, a million won't do it. Make it 2 million. So you push and push and push. Finally you die of a heart attack or something, or even in that life, but whether in that life or in another, you can't get away from it. The pendulum's got to fall and go in the other direction. Every success has to be followed by failure. It's really quite a daunting thing to wake up and discover some fine day that you've been working literally all these millions of lives, you've been struggling to achieve nothing. The end of everything has to be zero, because every plus has to be balanced by a minus. Now, isn't that wonderful? You built this beautiful house, you've been struggling and sweating all your life, you finally got 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom house, 2 cars, wonderful job. Something's going to go wrong. Listen, you can't avoid it. And if you skip this life and you live a happy life this time, it'll come along sooner or later. The people who are unhappy in this life are just you in another life. Every life is a balance of plus and minus. It's the secret of existence. The only way out of it is to understand that you are not that. The more you can turn your energy back to the self, the more you can go from defining yourself in terms of this little gas jet, this little ego, and seeing, but that self is who I really am. You know, the wonderful thing about Yogananda and about great saints, all of them, is basically this, that in not existing, they're omnipresent. Yogananda was everybody. He was a reflection of everyone with whom he was. He was free, and in that freedom he could assume all roles and no role. Instead of being suddenly deprived of any self-definition, when you have no self-definition, you find you can define yourself any way you like and know that you are the reality behind all definitions. There is a freedom in that state that is far more rewarding than thinking that I want to be successful at this and I want to do that. You know, in fact, that you can do everything. But there's something else to it, too. You see that whenever you have to depend on your own strength, be self-reliant in the Emersonian sense, and that was a great essay that he wrote on self-reliance. We need to have that sense of self-reliance. And yet at the same time, in having it, you discover that if you rely too much on this little self, you are subject to an awful lot of things over which you have absolutely no control. Somebody was fired from a job recently, a friend of mine. He said, but I was doing a good job. Why did they fire me? Well, the answer is that they weren't thinking of him. They were saying, we've got to lop off 20,000 of our employees, and you're among those 20,000. He's not a person to them. He has no control over it. They have no control over it. You can't help what happens to you so many times in this world. Yes, it's karma, sure. But more than that, you don't even know what your karma is half the time. I read just not long ago about a couple who had just gotten married and were driving off on their honeymoon, were killed in a car accident. Now, that is life. It may not happen this way, this time, this day, but it happens again and again. You don't have control over your destiny. But, and here's the other side of it, not only must you learn to develop, to have a reliance on a deeper self than this little ego, but a broader self that really does manage things for the best, because there is a certain rhythm in life. There's a certain perfection in the flow of life if we get into that flow. But because we're always telling life, no, I don't want it to be this way, I want it to be this way, we interfere and we prevent that flow from happening as it could. Many a time when, well, I'll tell you a very good story. It's a true story, at least it was told to me as true, of a man who was an older man, very calm, very serene, wise. And a young man looked up to him as an example and felt that he could learn much from him. And one day he said to him, what is the secret of your wisdom? I'd love to know. How is it that you can handle the difficulties of life and just let them roll off your back and always seem to come out on top? And the man said, look, I'll tell you. He said, the answer to it is in a drawer. And he took him to a drawer in his bedroom and opened the drawer. There was a little fragile shell there. And the young man said, well, what's this? So the older man said, many years ago I was very gung-ho to succeed. And I was very, very rich, very powerful, very successful. I had what I thought was everything. And then in 1929, the stock market crashed. And overnight, I lost everything. And I decided there was nothing to live for. I sent my wife and children away. I took a little house by the ocean, and I determined to kill myself. I went out into the water and determined to let the waves just take me out to sea until I drowned. And as I tried to go, the waves were so strong that they threw me back. And every time I tried to go into the water, the waves threw me back. And one time I was thrown down on the sand and was struggling up, and I saw this little fragile shell. And I thought, how can I, with my strength, not stand up against these waves? And yet this little shell, so fragile, has been able to survive all this beating. And I thought, well, the answer is that it went with the waves instead of trying to fight them. And he thought, that's what I've got to learn. He said, I've been fighting the waves of life. I've just got to accept that maybe this wave crashed on me, made me broke instead of wealthy, for a reason. Maybe there's something I have to learn. And so he kept this as a talisman. And he began to think, what does his life really mean? And from that day on, he said, I began to live life instead of just fighting it all the time. And I began to find what was really important and what was true wealth, which is happiness. And in this way, each one of us needs to learn that the flow of life is not meant to break you. It's not meant to throw you back to zero all the time. We could enjoy this world if we went with it, if we went with the divine currents. God's not a sadist. We're the ones who are masochists. We want to suffer, and so we do. But God, if we live in tune with Him, you could live a happy life. Because all the currents, if you don't have desires and don't interpose your desires and say, I want it this way, sound like people at a horse race shouting, all excited about one horse, when maybe it's destined that another horse win. Don't get excited about things, just let them go. You'll be amazed to see how there is a source there that sort of sustains you. I've seen this. Yogananda, one time, sometimes trivial examples mean more, in a sense, than great examples, because you think, well, the divine will, you'd expect the divine will to step in important situations, but in trivial ones, you sort of don't quite expect it so much. Yogananda, one time, he used to like to go by a place in Laguna Beach on his way down to Encinitas that made some good Scotch shortbread, which he enjoyed. And he stopped at this place and sent one of his disciples in to get some. And the disciple came back and said that they were all out of it. Well, Yogananda wasn't disappointed. He had no desire, just little thoughts. But he was surprised because he thought, well, Divine Mother never has let me down. And so instead of saying, Divine Mother, why did you do this? He just said, well, Divine Mother, how come? Just sort of surprised, that's all. As soon as he said that, he saw this light come down onto that building. And a moment later, that woman came rushing out, wait. She said, I have some shortbread that I made for a customer, but I can make her another batch. This is for you. Well, this is just a little example. You can say, well, beautiful coincidence. But the thing is that when you begin to see these things happening again and again, you begin to think there's something suspicious going on here. And it happens in little ways, it happens in big ways. I'll tell you a little way. My father all worked most of his life abroad in Czechoslovakia, Romania, Venezuela, Egypt, France, and so on. He was stationed abroad with the oil company that employed him. And he was in France toward the end of his life, and I was living at Mount Washington. And I used to remember, because I had gone to school in Switzerland, and I remembered Swiss chocolate as the best anywhere. And I never saw it in this country. It was available, but not much. Back in those days, this was about 1950 or so. It was a little later than that. Anyway, around then. There was some Swiss chocolate, but I never saw it here. So anyway, I kept thinking, but it was such a mild desire that I never remembered to ask them to send it to me when I wrote to them. So it was a week before my birthday, and I thought, well, mind you, you've got to share these thoughts with God. So if I just thought it wouldn't have been the same thing. But I said, Divine Mother, I always pray to God as my Divine Mother. I said, Divine Mother, it would have been nice to have, but it doesn't matter. Well, it's a strange thing. Of course, I had no time to write to them. They had no time to send it. But a day before my birthday, I got a little package in the mail with some Swiss chocolate, and a member in our congregation in Hollywood said she was passing a shop that day and saw this Swiss chocolate in the window and thought of me and felt the impulse to buy it. That sort of thing, I gave most of it away. It was so trivial. If Divine Mother had saved my life, I could have thought, well, she needed me, okay. But a little trivial thing like that, you can say, well, it's coincidence. But listen, a lot of things like that have happened to me. A lot. I was driving on the freeway on Skyline one time, and all of a sudden the car ran out of gas. And I thought, well, Divine Mother, what do we do now? I saw an exit, so I pulled off the exit. There was a hill, so I went down the hill. I kept coasting, no gas, coasting. Finally, the hill began to level out. I thought, well, now we're going to run out. Doesn't matter, Divine Mother, whatever you want. So as I was running out of momentum, I saw a gas station on the left, pulled into the gas station, stopped right by the pump. This kind of thing, if it happens once, again, coincidence, happens all the time. you begin to think there's something to it. Now, mind you, Divine Mother is not always going to lard you with honey. She's going to give you a few tests also. But if you say, God, you're giving it to me, it comes from you, you'll see that it's always a blessing. No zeros involved at all because there are no ciphers involved, no numbers involved. You're not counting anymore. Like this woman who came to a guest and said, would you like another cookie? He said, well, would you like a cookie? She said, no, thanks, I've already had one. She said, you've had two, but who's counting? Well, so if you stop counting and stop thinking, oh, I got this, no, I lost that, there's no coming back to zero in that case. It's all just a flow. Life becomes beautiful, and you see that there is a power that sustains you. There is somebody who is there. I've told a recent story recently that it always thrills me every time I think of it. In California, there was an Indian friend of mine from the state of Orissa, south of Bengal, who he graduated and went back to India. And I went to India a few years later, and the one regret that I had was that I didn't have his address, so I couldn't look him up. And I came to Calcutta, and my regret only in coming to Calcutta was the thought that it would have been nice to see my old friend again. Well, here's what happened. The plane arrived. Nobody was there to meet me. Now, you know what the usual thing to do is when you're expecting to be met is rush to the nearest phone, isn't it? Well, I was there with Divine Mother. So I said, Divine Mother, what do you have in mind? If I had run to the nearest phone, this would not have happened. I said, Divine Mother, in that moment, somebody stopped in front of me and looked at me. He said, what is your good name? I told him. He said, I thought it must be you. He said, a friend of mine who was in America has some pictures of you and showed me your picture. And I thought it had to be you. And I said, who was his friend? And he said, Dr. Mishra, who was this friend of mine whom I wanted to meet. And I said, oh, I've been wanting to meet him. He said, oh, you don't have to. I said, could you give me his address? He said, you don't need it. I've just come to Calcutta to meet him. He said, if you come with me, I'll take you to him. And these friends of mine who should have come were held up by traffic, and we contacted, and we got in touch the next day. But you see, a little thing like that. But how God sustains you, the more you give your life to him and let him handle it. And when things start going wrong, it isn't because he doesn't like you, it's because you forgot to like him. You forgot to include him in the picture. Listen, we're a country that likes to experiment. I'd like to propose just this simple experiment. Try it. Try including God in what you do. Try asking him, telling him, sharing with him. Try to say, not I have to do it myself, but God, I'll do my best, but what shall we do together? Give it more to him. Don't be passive. He doesn't like that. But if you do your best and do it for him and say that everything you have belongs to him, there was a story of a man who loved God very deeply. He was married, had worldly responsibilities, but he said, God, you're my first love. And if ever you call me, I will leave everything and come to you and meditate on you. But as long as you want me here, I'm here. I'm only doing it for you. And so he felt inside that God said, I've listened to your prayer. I will answer in my time. His wife gave birth to their first child. She died in childbirth, and so the child didn't die, but the child was lying there without a mother. At that moment, mind you, God tests you. God said, come, my beloved. You've promised to come to me. Now I say, come. Give your life to me. Well, this, can you imagine a situation like that? His little squalling child, no one to take care of it, no mother. God is saying, leave this child. How could anybody? He couldn't do it. And yet he believed in God. He said, God, I absolutely believe in you, but my human heart wants at least to be satisfied that you will take care of this child. So he went and he hid in a bush and waited. And the chariot of the Maharani, the queen of that area, came driving by and heard this squalling baby, stopped the chariot, came in and saw it and saw that it was alone and said, I will take this child in my home. So the queen took that child and raised it. And the man saw God gave that baby a much better home than he could have given it. And so then he was free to go. But God tested him, and the man acted right. He couldn't just blindly leave that child, and yet his faith was right. God was not calling him irresponsibly. God would and did take care of that baby. And you will see that God will test you. He's bound to test you. Everything that you've tried for, he will make it seem as if it's failed. Nothing can succeed. Everything is blowing up in your face. If you say, God, it's yours, it's not mine, you will see. And I don't know, everybody gets tested, but it seems to me in a way that those who love God get more. Perhaps just to finish things off faster, I don't know. I have to say that, quite honestly, there have been times in my life when it looked to me and to anyone else who was looking as if everything had been destroyed. And yet I have to say that those were individually and all together the most successful things in my life, the greatest blessings in my life. One time Yogananda had the temple that he used to love to lecture in, beautiful building in Encinitas, washed away in a landslide. And I heard somebody say to him once, what a tragedy. Yogananda said, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Why? Because it forced him to go out and teach in other cities, spread the message further. It was a blessing. Everything that God gives you, if you understand that you are reliant not on this little ego, which is so fragile, so completely incompetent. It's really like a reef in a wind. You just never know when it's going to be beaten down. But if you understand that you're a part of that greater self, you will be subjected to all sorts of things, yes, but you won't mind. It won't matter. You'll enjoy it all, actually. It does become a joy. You know, when I was thrown out of SRF, it was the greatest tragedy that was imaginable for me. Greatest because it was the only thing I wanted, the only thing I believed in. Others didn't understand it. I knew. It seemed as if I had lost the only thing to which I had really pledged my life. I couldn't imagine what else to live for, yet I wouldn't have all of this if it hadn't been for that. But you know, even at the time, I felt a certain joy that never left me. He never takes that joy away. If you'll calm your mind and look a little more deeply, you'll see the joy is there. That's what counts. If you can be reliant on that greater self and know that it is yourself, it's not that he's sort of indifferent, sort of looking at you sometimes, looking the other way. Sometimes he's you. He's your infinite self. The more you live in that infinite self, the more you see that there is always something sustaining you. And death itself can stare you in the face, and you will welcome it with open arms, knowing that wherever you go, you're just like that little fragile shell, swept with the currents, not thinking that it needs to go do anything by its own power, but offer your power into that current, and you will see that where the current might take you 1 yard, it will take you a mile. Join your strength to his, join his strength to yours, and you will see that you are all powerful. Joy to you.